The fluorescent lights of the downtown coffee shop cast harsh shadows across Rebecca Winter's hands as she wiped down the counter for what felt like the 1,000th time that shift. Her fingers ached from 12 hours of steaming milk and measuring grounds with mechanical precision. The manager had already warned her twice this week about looking too exhausted during customer interactions, as if she could somehow separate the bone-deep weariness from her professional smile. Her phone buzzed against her hip. The text from Mrs. Patterson lit up the screen with 3 words that turned Rebecca's stomach to ice. Need my place back by Monday. 2 days. She had 2 days to find somewhere else for herself and 3 daughters to sleep. Rebecca deleted the message and returned to scrubbing espresso stains that had long since become permanent fixtures in the countertop grain. The motion kept her hands busy while her mind cataloged and dismissed options with ruthless efficiency. Her cousin in Hartford had already made it clear their guest room wasn't available again. The women's shelter had a 6-week maximum stay, and their time had run out 3 days ago. The car worked for emergencies, but November in Connecticut meant temperatures dropping below freezing at night. The last customer of her shift walked out, leaving behind a newspaper folded to the classified section. Rebecca was reaching for it to toss in recycling when a small box advertisement in the lower right corner stopped her hand mid-motion. House for sale. $1. Must see to believe. Cash only. 1247 Oakwood Avenue. She stared at the words until they blurred, then refocused, certain she'd misread. $1 for an entire house. The rational part of her brain screamed scam or condemned property or both. But desperation has a way of making even impossible options seem worth investigating. Rebecca tore out the advertisement with careful precision, folded it twice, and slipped it into her apron pocket, where it settled against her thigh like a secret or a promise. The walk from the coffee shop to the homeless shelter took 40 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively more worn. Rebecca's daughters waited in the common area. Brenda with her nose in a library book she'd already read twice. Nicole attempting math homework at a table surrounded by noise and chaos. Rachel drawing elaborate houses with crayons on the back of donation flyers. Rachel spotted her first and launched across the room. "Mommy, when can we go home?" Rebecca caught her youngest daughter and held on perhaps a moment too long, breathing in the strawberry scent of cheap shampoo from the shelter's communal bathrooms. "Soon, baby. Very soon." Brenda looked up from her book, and something in her 12-year-old eyes suggested she knew exactly how hollow that promise sounded. The girl had become too perceptive, too aware of the carefully constructed lies adults told children to shield them from ugly truths. Rebecca met her daughter's gaze and saw the question forming, saw Brenda decide against asking it, saw her return to a book she'd already memorized because pretending was easier than confronting. That night Rebecca lay awake on her assigned cot listening to her daughters breathe in the bunks nearby. The shelter rules were clear, 6 weeks maximum, no exceptions, and their time had expired. Tomorrow they'd be back to borrowed couches and backseat arrangements, shuffling between the few friends who hadn't yet learned to avoid her calls. The advertisement crinkled in her pocket when she rolled over. $1. What could possibly be wrong with a house that cost less than a cup of the coffee she'd been serving all day? Morning brought the answer in brutally clear detail. Rebecca had called the number from a payphone outside a gas station, gotten directions from a bored city clerk who seemed bemused by her interest, and marshaled her daughters for the 14-block walk to Oakwood Avenue. The neighborhood declined block by block like descending stairs into a basement. Paint peeled from houses that still showed signs of habitation yards grew wilder, for sale signs accumulated rust and tilt. By the time they reached 1247 Oakwood, Nicole had gone quiet in that particular way that meant she was calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. The house stood like a patient waiting for diagnosis. Built in the 1920s craftsman style, it might once have been charming with its wide porch and distinctive brackets. Now the porch sagged at a concerning angle. Every window showed cracks or boards, and the jungle of weeds in the front yard had achieved a height that suggested years of neglect. The whole structure leaned slightly to the left, as if the foundation had given up arguing with gravity. Rachel pressed against Rebecca's leg and whispered, It looks like a monster house. Nicole's silence spoke louder than any commentary. She simply stared at the building with the same expression she'd worn when the eviction notice arrived at their old apartment. Brenda walked a slow circle around the perimeter, observing details with the methodical attention she brought to everything. When she returned, her face held neither judgment nor hope, just assessment. The house was broken. Whether it could be fixed remained to be seen. A voice called from the neighboring property. "You hear about the Harris place?" The man who emerged from the house next door moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had accumulated decades of small betrayals. Donald Thompson introduced himself as a retired city assessor, mentioned he'd lived on this block for 43 years, and studied Rebecca's face with eyes that had witnessed too many neighborhood declines to be surprised by much. Rebecca found herself explaining their situation in broad strokes, editing out the most desperate details, while knowing the truth probably showed anyway. 3 daughters, recent hardship, looking for fresh start. The euphemisms felt hollow in her mouth. Thompson nodded as if he'd heard variations on this story before. The city's been trying to unload this property for 3 years. Original owner William Harris died back in 1998. His daughter moved away, no heirs willing to take on the tax burden. They just want someone to accept responsibility for it so they can stop paying to maintain the lot. He paused to let that sink in before continuing with the litany of problems. Foundation's solid, built on bedrock, which is why it's still standing. But the roof leaks in a dozen places. Plumbing hasn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. Electrical work is a fire hazard, and the basement floods every spring without fail. Nicole, who'd been listening with the focused attention she usually reserved for math problems, asked the question Rebecca had been avoiding. How much would it cost to fix? Thompson's expression softened, looking at the 3 girls. $60,000 minimum, maybe more depending on what you find once you start opening walls. The number hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca had $73 in her wallet, representing 2 weeks of tips and the last of their savings after Christopher's debts had been settled. 60,000 might as well have been 60 million. But Thompson was still studying her face, and something in his assessment must have triggered a decision, because his next words came gentler. "You got kids. I can see you need a place. City Hall closes in 45 minutes. If you're serious about this, I'll walk you through the paperwork. But Mrs. Winters, I want you to understand what you're taking on. This isn't a house. It's a project that will consume every spare moment and dollar you have for the next several years." Rebecca looked at her daughters. Brenda met her eyes with that too adult comprehension. Nicole had already pulled out the small notebook she carried everywhere and was scribbling calculations. Rachel simply waited with the infinite patience of children who'd learned that adult decisions took time. The shelter wouldn't take them back. The friends' couches had all been exhausted. Winter was coming and the car's heater worked intermittently at best. Sometimes the choice isn't between good and bad, but between terrible and slightly less terrible. "Let's go to City Hall." The transaction took 2 hours and felt simultaneously surreal and bureaucratic. Clerks shuffled through dusty files dating back decades, typed information into computer systems that clearly predated the current century, and made small jokes about Rebecca's impending status as a property owner. One clerk, finalizing the paperwork, handed over a tarnished key with a smirk. "Good luck with your palace. Hope you've got good insurance." Rebecca signed her name on documents that transferred ownership of 1,247 Oakwood Avenue to her for the price of $1 bill and 73 cents in processing fees. The deed felt heavy in her hands despite being just paper, a physical manifestation of commitment to something she couldn't yet envision as home. Walking back to the house with the key in her pocket, Rebecca tried to inventory their resources. $72 remaining, 2 sleeping bags borrowed from the shelter, a handful of cleaning supplies, 3 daughters who'd already proven themselves capable of adapting to circumstances no child should have to navigate. The key stuck in the lock, resisting for a moment before yielding with a protest of corroded metal. The door swung inward on hinges that shrieked, revealing an interior that somehow managed to look worse than the exterior had promised. The smell hit first, Decades of accumulated mustiness mixed with something organic and wrong like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The living room stretched before them empty except for water stains mapping the ceiling's failures and ancient wallpaper peeling in long strips that curled like scrolls. Floorboards creaked ominously under even Rachel's weight, and the afternoon light filtering through boarded windows cast everything in amber gloom. Nicole walked to the kitchen and tried the faucet. After a moment's hesitation, brown water coughed from the tap in spurts before settling into a rust-colored trickle. She turned it off and looked at Rebecca without comment. The state of the plumbing had been adequately demonstrated. Brenda climbed the stairs with deliberate care, testing each step before committing her weight. Rebecca followed, discovering 3 bedrooms upstairs, all empty, all wearing the same expression of abandonment. The bathroom fixtures had oxidized beyond any hope of mere cleaning, and something had nested in the walls based on the scratching sounds that emerged when they stood still. They returned to the first floor where Rachel had discovered the basement door. She stood before it, one hand on the knob, not opening it. "It smells funny down there." Rebecca gently moved her daughter aside and tried the door herself. It opened onto darkness and a wave of cold, damp air that carried notes of earth and mildew. She fumbled for a light switch, found one, flipped it. Nothing happened. The electrical situation would need to be addressed before any basement exploration occurred. The sun was setting by the time they'd completed their initial survey. Rebecca gathered the girls in the least damaged corner of the living room and spread out the sleeping bags. She'd used her last $15 on candles and a camping lantern from the hardware store 3 blocks away, and now their light cast dancing shadows that transformed water stains into abstract art. Rain began as they settled in for the night, and within minutes Rebecca understood the true scope of the roof situation. Water dripped from at least 7 locations in the living room alone. She deployed every pot bucket and container they owned to catch the streams, creating a percussion ensemble that would serve as their first night's soundtrack. Rachel burrowed into her sleeping bag and asked with the directness of 6-year-olds who haven't yet learned to fear honest answers, "Are we pioneers now, Mommy?" Rebecca brushed hair from her daughter's forehead, feeling the dampness of the room already settling into their temporary bedding. "Something like that, baby." Nicole had been studying the ceiling with the same analytical expression she brought to word problems. "The leaks follow the support beam pattern. We'll need to replace at least 3 sections of roof decking, probably more, and that's assuming the rafters aren't compromised." At 10 years old, she'd somehow accumulated knowledge of residential construction. Rebecca made a mental note to ask where that information had come from, then dismissed it as irrelevant. They'd need every scrap of knowledge available, regardless of source. Brenda had remained silent through dinner, which consisted of peanut butter sandwiches eaten sitting on sleeping bags. Now she spoke for the first time since they'd returned from City Hall. "What if we can't fix it?" The question hung in the air alongside the sound of rain and dripping water. Rebecca looked at her oldest daughter's face, barely visible in the candlelight, and saw genuine fear beneath the carefully maintained composure. "Then we'll live with broken things until we can," Rebecca heard herself say. "But we'll live here together as a family in our own home." The words felt simultaneously like a promise and a threat. Own home carried weight when you'd spent weeks sleeping in shelters and borrowed spaces, but the qualifier mattered: own home that might collapse, flood, or burn down depending on which system failed first. After the girls had fallen asleep despite the percussion of rain and dripping water, Rebecca sat alone by the window overlooking Oakwood Avenue. Streetlights illuminated the empty road, the overgrown yards, the other abandoned houses quietly deteriorating in the darkness. She'd made so many promises to her daughters over the past months. Promises about stability and security and returning to normal. Promises broken not by choice but by circumstances that had spiraled beyond her control when Christopher disappeared with their savings and left behind debts that consumed everything else. This house, this broken, leaking cold structure that cost $1, couldn't be another failed promise. She wouldn't allow it. The alternative, returning to shelters, to cars, to the hollow-eyed exhaustion of mothers who'd lost the fight, felt like a cliff edge she'd been walking toward for months. This house represented the last piece of solid ground before the drop. Rebecca whispered into the darkness, making a vow to herself rather than to sleeping children who couldn't be burdened with the weight of their mother's determination. This is not our forever, but I will build us something new from this. The morning revealed damage that had hidden in yesterday's fading light. The kitchen faucet produced only rust-colored water no matter how long she let it run. The toilet in the upstairs bathroom had a crack running through the bowl that made it unusable for anything beyond decoration. Every window had at least one broken pane, and the front door's lock worked only intermittently. Rebecca enrolled the girls at Lincoln Elementary, a tired brick building 7 blocks away that served the neighborhood's remaining families. The principal, Mrs. Linda Martinez, raised her eyebrows when Rebecca provided the Oakwood Avenue address. The Harris place. Someone actually bought it. The judgment in the question stung more than Rebecca wanted to acknowledge. She simply nodded and filled out the required paperwork while her daughters waited in plastic chairs. Brenda reading Nicole sketching building diagrams in her notebook, Rachel swinging her legs and humming tunelessly. Mrs. Martinez's expression softened as she processed the enrollment forms. "Welcome to Lincoln Elementary," she told the girls. "We're glad to have you." With the girls in school, Rebecca had 6 hours each weekday to address the house's most critical failures. She started by calling Kenneth Walker, a plumber she'd worked with years ago when she was still nursing at Riverton General. Kenneth had a sister who'd undergone chemotherapy, and Rebecca had been the one to advocate for better pain management, to hold the family's hands through the worst nights, to explain the medical terminology in language that made sense. He'd told her then that he owed her, and now she was collecting on that debt. Kenneth arrived in a truck that had seen better decades and descended into the basement with a flashlight and an expression that grew progressively grimmer as he examined the plumbing. When he emerged, he didn't sugarcoat the assessment. "Rebecca, this place is a disaster. The pipes are original to the house, probably lead. The whole system needs to be gutted and replaced. We're talking walls opened, new routing, updated fixtures throughout." Rebecca forced herself to ask the question whose answer she already knew would hurt. "How much?" Kenneth pulled off his work gloves and met her eyes. $9,000 minimum. That's with me doing the labor at cost, no profit margin, calling in favors for materials. If you hired a regular contractor, you're looking at $15,000 easily. $9,000 might as well have been $9 million. Rebecca thanked him and walked him to the door, then returned to the empty kitchen and allowed herself exactly 20 minutes to sit on the floor and cry. The girls would be home from school in 4 hours. She couldn't afford to waste time on despair. When the tears stopped, Rebecca made a list. Everything that needed fixing, categorized by urgency and cost. The list filled 3 pages and probably represented 6 months of work, even if she had unlimited funds. Since she had $72, the timeline stretched toward infinity, but some problems could be addressed with labor instead of money. Rebecca had never considered herself particularly handy, but desperation proved an excellent teacher. She found tutorials on YouTube for patching drywall, replacing outlet covers, fixing loose floorboards. The library had books on basic home repair. The hardware store owner, Timothy Scott, noticed her buying odd lots of supplies and offered a contractor's discount when she explained she'd bought the Harris place. "That house deserves better than what William Harris gave it," Timothy said, and something in his tone suggested history Rebecca didn't understand. She accepted the discount and didn't ask questions. The girls helped after school. Nicole had a surprising aptitude for electrical work, carefully labeling wires and testing outlets under Rebecca's supervision. Brenda organized the salvaged materials they collected from dumpsters and curbsides, creating an inventory system that would have impressed a warehouse manager. Rachel sorted screws and nails by size, made labels with careful printing, and turned the tedious work into a game. Progress came in increments so small they were almost invisible day to day. One room got electricity, then another. The hot water heater Kenneth installed, a used unit from a salvage yard that cost $60, meant they could shower in their own bathroom instead of using the facilities at the community center. 3 weeks into November, Rebecca woke to Nicole standing beside her sleeping bag. "Mom, that smell is back. Worse than before." The basement had been one problem Rebecca had deliberately avoided. It was dank dark, probably full of mold and structural issues she couldn't afford to address. But the smell Nicole mentioned had been growing stronger for days, and now it permeated the first floor strongly enough that ignoring it was no longer an option. Rebecca equipped herself with supplies, phoned for flashlight N95 mask from her old nursing supplies crowbar purchased at a yard sale for $3, and Kenneth's small toolkit he'd left behind. The wooden stairs creaked ominously as she descended each step, announcing her presence to whatever waited below. The smell hit with physical force despite the mask. Sweet and nauseating, definitely organic, but underneath it ran something metallic and sharp that made her nose burn. The basement sprawled larger than she'd expected, running the full length of the house above. Stone walls wept moisture, and the dirt floor had turned to mud in patches where water seeped through the foundation. Rebecca followed her nose to the far corner where the smell concentrated into something almost solid. Her flashlight beam swept across the stone wall, looking for cracks or gaps where an animal might have died and become trapped. Instead, she noticed something that made her stop moving entirely. One section of the wall looked different. Not dramatically so, but enough that once she'd noticed it, the difference became obvious. The stones were the same age and composition as the rest of the basement, but the mortar between them was lighter, newer. While the rest of the basement showed over a century of water damage, and settling this section looked like it had been repointed perhaps 30 or 40 years ago. The smell seemed to emanate from behind this newer section of wall. Rebecca positioned the crowbar between two stones where the mortar looked weakest and applied pressure. The first stone came loose with surprising ease, as if it had been placed without much mortar at all. The smell rushed out like something alive, so overpowering that Rebecca stumbled backward and fell to her knees, dry heaving into the mask. When she could breathe again, she loosened two more stones, creating a gap large enough to shine her light through. What the beam revealed made no sense. Instead of dirt or a dead animal, the light illuminated a small room carved from bedrock, maybe 6 feet wide, 9 feet deep, and filling every inch of that space stacked floor to ceiling were metal containers. Rebecca pulled away more stones with hands that had started shaking. The containers looked like old ammunition boxes, green metal with latched lids. Some were stacked with precision. Others had toppled over, and several had broken open, spilling contents across the small room's floor. The terrible smell wasn't coming from the containers themselves, but from something in the corner. A canvas bag rotted almost to nothing, revealing bits of leather, scraps of fabric, and something white that Rebecca's nursing background identified immediately as bone. A partial skull rested among the debris, one empty eye socket pointed in her direction as if observing her discovery. But it was the spilled contents of the broken containers that made Rebecca's knees weak despite the grim company of the skeleton. Even in the dim phone light, the unmistakable glint of gold scattered across the floor like someone had dumped a pirate's treasure chest. Not jewelry or coins, but raw gold in every form. Nuggets the size of her fist, bars stamped with numbers, flakes and dust that caught the light and threw it back in warm amber reflections. Rebecca counted 42 containers in total. More than half remained sealed. The ones that had broken open revealed consistent contents. Gold. More gold than she'd ever imagined existed outside of movies or museum displays. She sat on the bottom basement step for 5 full minutes, hands shaking so badly she had to set down the phone to avoid dropping it. The practical part of her brain started calculating. If even a few containers held real gold at current market prices, the value would be in the thousands, tens of thousands, maybe more. But the larger part of her mind spun with questions that felt dangerous. Who had hidden gold in her basement wall? When had they done it? And what about the human remains handcuffed in the corner? Rebecca thought about the house's history as she understood it. Built in the 1920s, owned by the Harris family for generations until William Harris died in 1998. His daughter Dorothy had moved away. No heirs willing to take on the property. Donald Thompson might know more about the previous owners, but asking questions meant admitting what she'd found. And if there were human remains down here, remains that appeared to have been restrained based on the handcuffs visible among the bones, then this wasn't just a hidden treasure. This was evidence of a crime. Rebecca climbed the stairs and made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She sat at the kitchen table until the girls came home from school, her mind churning through possibilities that all seemed to end badly. Gold hidden in walls didn't arrive there by accident. People who sealed rooms behind stone walls and left skeletons to guard treasure weren't usually the kind of people who came by their wealth honestly. But when Brenda, Nicole, and Rachel burst through the door, chattering about their day and homework and the new friends they were making, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility settle into her bones with crushing finality. For the first time in months, her daughters were sleeping in warm beds. They had an address, a school district, a place where they belonged. The gold could wait one more night. After the girls had fallen asleep, Rebecca returned to the basement with her phone gloves and a notebook. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before making any decisions. The hidden room looked even more surreal in the steady light. She photographed everything from multiple angles, then carefully lifted one of the smaller spilled pieces of gold. The weight surprised her, denser than she'd expected, and the metal felt different from any jewelry she'd owned. Softer, more malleable. Her nursing school chemistry classes came back in fragments. Pure gold was soft, dense, had specific properties that made it unmistakable once you knew what to look for. In the corner, she forced herself to examine what remained of the canvas bag and its contents more closely. Definitely human remains, though decades in the damp basement had reduced them to fragments. Along with the bones lay scraps of clothing, a rotted leather wallet, and the handcuffs she'd noticed before. Something else caught her attention, a small metal name tag partially readable through the corrosion. The letters F. Cla were still visible. Rebecca photographed everything, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Whatever story this room told, she was now part of it. The smart thing, the right thing, would be to call the police immediately. Report the find. Let authorities sort out the gold and the skeleton and all the questions that came with both. But smart and practical were two different things when you had 3 daughters and $72 to your name. She resealed the opening with the loose stones, carefully arranging them to look undisturbed. Then she climbed the stairs and spent the rest of the night at her laptop researching. Gold prices on the current market. Missing persons cases from the 1980s and 1990s. Legal implications of treasure found on your own property. The laws surrounding discovered remains. By morning, she'd made a decision that surprised even herself. She would do both. Give the victim's family closure and secure her family's future. Not either or. Both. The plan formed in stages, each step feeling simultaneously logical and insane. She would send an anonymous tip to the FBI about the remains. Provide enough information for them to recover the body and solve what was clearly a very old murder. But she wouldn't mention the gold. The containers would stay hidden until she figured out how to convert their contents into legitimate resources for her daughters. Rebecca drove to a library 2 towns over, used a public computer with a privacy screen, and kept her baseball cap pulled low. The letter took an hour to compose, every word chosen with care. She typed the address of the FBI field office and detailed the location of the remains at 1247 Oakwood Avenue. She explained about the repointed section of basement wall, about the handcuffs and the partial name tag. She stated her belief that the remains belonged to someone connected to an old crime, possibly from the 1980s, based on the condition of the materials. She emphasized that the current homeowner had no knowledge of the remains and should not be considered involved. She signed it "A Concerned Citizen" and included 3 photographs, the skeleton from a distance, the handcuffs, and the name tag. Nothing that showed gold, nothing that could be traced back to her beyond the general location. Rebecca mailed the letter from a post office 3 towns in the opposite direction, using cash for stamps and wearing gloves to handle the envelope. No return address, no identifiable marks. Then she returned home and began the careful, dangerous process of extracting her family's future from the basement wall, 1 container at a time. The extraction operation required precision Rebecca hadn't known she possessed. Each container weighed between 35 and 55 pounds, depending on contents and hauling them up. The narrow basement stairs demanded strength her nursing career had built, but never tested quite like this. She developed a system born of necessity and paranoia. 7:45. Each morning she dropped the girls at Lincoln Elementary, watching them disappear through the double doors before returning to Oakwood Avenue. 9 o'clock to 11 became her window. Neighbors who remained on the block mostly worked day shifts or stayed inside during cold November mornings. Rebecca would descend to the basement, load 2 or sometimes 3 containers into a large duffel bag Kenneth had left behind, carry them through the house with brakes to rest her screaming shoulders, and load them into the SUV's trunk beneath a tarp and camping gear she'd purchased at a thrift store. The storage unit sat 30 miles north in a different county, entirely rented under a false name she'd purchased online through channels that made her feel simultaneously clever and criminal. The fake ID had cost $200. She couldn't afford money earned from selling the first small piece of gold to a pawn shop in a strip mall she'd never visit again. But the investment meant no paper trail connecting Rebecca Winters to Unit 247 at the storage facility, no link between the struggling single mother and the fortune she was systematically removing from her basement. By 11:30, she'd return home, shower away, the basement's damp smell, eat something she barely tasted, and prepare to collect her daughters at 2:30. Evenings belonged to homework help and dinner preparation and the careful maintenance of normalcy that kept 3 children from asking questions their mother couldn't answer honestly. The process consumed 3 weeks, 21 days of moving 42 containers, one careful trip at a time, hyper-aware of every car that slowed near her house, every neighbor who glanced too long, every possible witness to activity that had no innocent explanation. Donald Thompson almost ended everything in week 2. Rebecca was loading what appeared to be a particularly heavy camping equipment bag into her trunk when his voice cut through the morning quiet. "That's a lot of gear for someone who just bought a house." Her heart seized, but her hands kept moving with the mechanical steadiness that came from pure terror. She turned and found him standing at the property line, leaning on his cane with that expression of benign curiosity elderly neighbors wore when observing the strange behavior of younger generations. "Clearing out the basement," Rebecca heard herself say the lie smooth because she'd rehearsed variations for exactly this scenario. Previous owner left a lot of junk, too damaged to keep, but too solid for regular trash pickup. Thompson's eyes traveled from the duffel bag to her face and back again, lingering perhaps a moment too long. "Everything okay? You seem stressed lately." The concern in his voice nearly broke her composure. Here was a man who'd helped her navigate city bureaucracy, who'd shown kindness when he could have simply ignored another struggling family moving into a dying neighborhood, and she was lying to him while stealing gold that might have been connected to crimes he knew nothing about. "Just a lot of house projects," Rebecca managed. "It's overwhelming sometimes." He nodded slowly, accepted the explanation or chose not to press, and returned to his own property. But Rebecca's hands shook so badly loading the remaining container that she had to stop twice to steady herself. She'd been seen, noted. If anything went wrong, Thompson would remember this moment and connect dots she desperately needed to keep separate. Kenneth Walker created the second close call, though he didn't know it. He appeared unannounced during week 3, calling through the unlocked front door in that casual way people had when they considered themselves friendly helpers rather than visitors requiring permission. Rebecca was in the basement when she heard his voice echo down the stairs. "Rebecca, your door was open." She froze in the darkness, one hand on a container she'd been preparing to move, flashlight extinguished. The basement's layout meant Kenneth could descend partway and potentially see into the corner where the wall opening remained partially exposed. She'd gotten careless, too confident in her schedule, and now she stood trapped in the evidence of her crime with no way to explain what she was doing. His footsteps crossed the floor above weight, making boards creak in the familiar pattern of someone searching room to room. Rebecca's mind raced through possibilities. She could call up, claim she was checking for water damage. She could hide in the shadows and wait for him to leave. She could, "Rebecca, you down there." His voice came from the top of the stairs, not descending, just checking. She scrambled up, pulling the basement door closed behind her with perhaps more force than necessary. "Just inspecting for more leaks," she said, hearing the breathlessness in her own voice and hoping he'd attribute it to exertion rather than fear. "Smell's finally going away." Kenneth studied her face in the afternoon light filtering through repaired windows. Something in his expression suggested he noticed the tension, the slightly wild look she could feel in her own eyes but couldn't control. "You sure everything's all right? You seemed jumpy." How to explain the jumpiness without revealing its source? Rebecca gestured vaguely at the house around them. "Just tired. This place takes everything I have and asks for more." He seemed to accept that, or chose to, and left after checking the kitchen plumbing he'd ostensibly come to inspect. But Rebecca sat on the floor after his truck pulled away and admitted a truth she'd been avoiding. She was coming apart at the seams. The constant vigilance, the lies, the weight of secret knowledge, it was grinding her down in ways that showed despite her best efforts at concealment. Still she continued. What choice existed? Turn back now, and she'd moved 20 containers for nothing, exposed herself to risk without gaining the security those containers represented. The only path led forward through whatever waited on the other side of complete extraction. By the end of week 3, all 42 containers rested in Unit 247, stacked with the same precision William Harris had once used to hide them behind basement walls. Rebecca resealed the opening with mortar purchased in small quantities from different stores, mixing and applying it with techniques YouTube had taught her. She used a propane torch to age the surface, added artificial water stains that matched the surrounding wall, and stepped back to assess her work. Nearly impossible to tell which section had been disturbed. Not perfect experts would spot the difference, but good enough to pass casual inspection. She swept away every trace of her work, disposed of tools in dumpsters miles apart, and planted the final piece of her deception. The dead possum had been roadkill collected in a plastic bag and stored in the garage until this moment. Rebecca placed it in the basement's far corner with gloved hands, positioning it where the smell would seem to have originated. If anyone asked about the odor that had driven her to investigate the basement, she now had an innocent explanation complete with physical evidence. 3 days after she'd finished, the FBI came. The knock struck her door with the distinctive authority that said this wasn't a neighbor or delivery person. Rebecca had been washing lunch dishes while the girls were at school, and her hands went still in the soapy water. Every fear she'd been carrying for weeks crystallized into certainty before she even crossed the living room. 2 agents stood on her porch. The woman wore a dark suit that looked expensive even to Rebecca's untrained eye, sharp features arranged in professional neutrality. The man beside her had gray, threading his temples, and the particular stillness of someone comfortable with authority. "Mrs. Winters, I'm Agent Patricia Taylor with the FBI." The woman's voice matched her appearance, crisp and direct. "This is Agent Stephen Anderson from the Treasury Department Financial Crimes Division. We received an anonymous tip about possible evidence related to an old case. We'd like to search your basement if you don't mind." Rebecca's internal organs seemed to rearrange themselves, but her face maintained an expression she hoped conveyed appropriate confusion. "Of course. Is everything okay? Should I be worried about something?" Taylor's eyes tracked across Rebecca's features with the focus of someone trained to catalog micro-expressions and tells. "Just routine follow-up on a cold case. Nothing for you to worry about." Rebecca led them through the house to the basement door, every step feeling like walking toward a cliff edge. They descended the stairs with flashlights that cut through the dimness more effectively than her phone ever had, and she watched them work with the efficiency of people who'd processed hundreds of crime scenes. Taylor found the resealed wall section in under 10 minutes. Rebecca's stomach dropped as the agent ran gloved fingers along the mortar, testing its consistency against the surrounding wall. "Mrs. Winters, when did you do work on this wall?" The question felt like a trap with no safe answer. "I haven't worked on it. Why?" Taylor didn't respond directly. She and Anderson exchanged glances, some communication passing between them that Rebecca couldn't decipher. Then they began removing stones with practiced care, revealing the small room behind exactly as Rebecca had left it. Empty except for the skeleton still slumped in the corner, handcuffs visible among the bones. Anderson turned to Rebecca with an expression that might have been sympathy under different circumstances. "Mrs. Winters, we're going to need you and your family to stay elsewhere for a few days while we process this scene. Do you have somewhere you can go?" The motel cost $60 per night money. Rebecca couldn't afford but had no choice about spending. She packed bags for herself, and the girls explained that police needed to investigate something in the basement connected to an old case from before they'd bought the house, and tried to ignore the way Brenda's eyes tracked her every movement with suspicion that hadn't been there before. In the motel room that night, with Nicole and Rachel occupied with homework at the small desk, Brenda cornered her mother in the bathroom. The door closed, muffling sound creating a privacy that felt more threatening than protective. "What did they find?" Rebecca met her daughter's eyes in the mirror and saw Christopher's features looking back at her. Same bone structure, same intensity. But Brenda's gaze held something her father's never had the capacity to see through deception and demand truth. "I don't know exactly. They said it might be related to an old case from a long time ago." Brenda's jaw set in that particular way that meant she'd decided her mother was lying but couldn't prove it yet. "Is that why you've been acting strange since you went into the basement last month?" How had she noticed Rebecca had been so careful compartmentalizing her fear into the hours when her daughters slept or attended school? But Brenda had always been observant, always watching, always assembling puzzle pieces others didn't even realize they'd dropped. "I was worried about the smell, about what it might cost to fix whatever was causing it." The explanation sounded hollow even to Rebecca's ears. Brenda didn't argue, but the look she gave her mother before opening the bathroom door said everything words couldn't. "I know you're hiding something, and eventually I'll figure out what." 4 days in the motel stretched Rebecca's resources past breaking. She worked her coffee shop shifts and fielded questions from managers about why she looked even more exhausted than usual. She watched local news obsessively, but found no mention of the discovery. Whatever the FBI had found, they were keeping it quiet. On the 4th day, Taylor called and told her she could return home. They met at a coffee shop near the motel neutral territory that felt deliberately chosen to increase pressure through its publicness. Taylor slid a newspaper across the table before Rebecca had even ordered. The headline declared, "Remains of missing security guard found after 37 years." The article detailed the 1987 Cascade mining gold theft, the disappearance of security guard Joseph Clark, the decades of mystery surrounding both crimes. Anonymous tip had led authorities to remains in the basement of a property once owned by William Harris, a person of interest in the original investigation who had died in 1998 without ever being charged. Rebecca forced herself to read through the entire piece, aware that Taylor was watching her reaction with the focus of someone who made a career from reading people. "The remains appear to be those of Joseph Clark," Taylor said when Rebecca looked up. "Security guard who disappeared during a gold theft. His family's been looking for answers for 37 years. Thanks to whoever sent that anonymous tip, they'll finally be able to lay him to rest." Rebecca managed to make her voice convey appropriate relief. "That's wonderful. Do you know who killed him?" Taylor's eyes never left her face. "We believe it was William Harris, the previous owner of your house. He died in 1998, so we can't prosecute, but at least the family will have closure." A pause that stretched slightly too long waited with meaning. "You didn't know anything about this, did you? Nothing seemed strange when you bought the house." The question felt loaded with implications Rebecca couldn't fully map. She stuck as close to truth as possible. "I bought it for $1. I figured anything strange would be the least of my problems." Taylor nodded, and something in her expression suggested she was filing away details for later analysis. "That gold was never recovered, you know. Almost 220 pounds of raw gold. Worth about $60 million today." Her eyes locked onto Rebecca's. "Just vanished. Strange that Harris would hide a body, but not the gold. Don't you think—" Rebecca maintained her expression of innocent curiosity, though her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough she worried it might be visible through her shirt. "I wouldn't know anything about that. I'm just glad the family has answers." Taylor's silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before she finally spoke again. "The case is officially closed. Harris is dead. Clark's remains are found. The gold is still missing. You're free to return to your home, Mrs. Winters." But as Rebecca gathered her things to leave, Taylor added one more observation that felt less like conversation and more like warning. "You seem like a good mother, someone who'd do anything for her daughters. I respect that. But desperation makes people do things they normally wouldn't. Things that seem justified in the moment but have consequences they can't predict. Rebecca met the agent's eyes and saw something that might have been sympathy or might have been the patience of a predator willing to wait for prey to make a mistake. I appreciate the concern, Agent Taylor, but I'm just trying to keep my family together. The house felt different when they returned. Not physically changed, the FBI had left everything as they'd found it aside from the resealed basement wall, but psychologically altered. Rebecca couldn't walk through rooms without imagining agents cataloging details, making notes, forming theories. Had they measured dimensions? Calculated how much space the hidden room occupied? Wondered what had filled that space before they'd arrived. That night she sat on the edge of Rachel's bed, brushing her youngest daughter's hair, while Nicole practiced recorder down the hall and Brenda read by lamplight. For the first time since the eviction, warmth filled the rooms where her daughters slept, not just from the space heaters she'd managed to purchase, but from something more fundamental. The sense that this place, however broken it remained, belonged to them. Rebecca made a silent promise to herself and to the sleeping children who depended on her. Whatever it took, whatever the cost to her conscience, she would protect this fragile stability. The gold hidden in Unit 247 would become their salvation, not their downfall. She just had to be smart enough, patient enough, careful enough. Tomorrow she would begin researching how to convert raw gold into cash without triggering the kind of suspicion that brought federal agents to her door. December arrived with cold that found every gap in the house's defenses. Rebecca had managed to get the furnace working at limited capacity, focusing heat on the upstairs bedrooms while the kitchen and living room remained cold enough to see breath on particularly bitter mornings. The girls adapted without complaint, wearing layers indoors and gathering under blankets for movie nights on the second-hand laptop Kenneth had repaired. The Riverton Public Library became Rebecca's second home during school hours. She researched beyond the Harris family history, now diving into articles about gold markets and conversion strategies and the legal complexities surrounding treasure found on private property. She learned that raw gold raised questions, that large quantities triggered automatic reporting requirements, that dealers who asked no questions operated outside the law and carried risks that went beyond legal consequences. Her research into William Harris yielded a portrait of a man whose life had been poisoned by the crime he'd committed. Newspaper archives showed he'd worked for Cascade Mining's transport division from 1985 through 1987, called in sick the day of the theft, been investigated, but never charged. 6 months after Joseph Clark disappeared, Harris had paid off a $45,000 mortgage in cash. 3 months later, a $12,000 truck purchase, also cash. Early retirement at age 42 with supposed savings that his salary history couldn't support. Then the decline. Heavy drinking, isolation, paranoia that neighbors remembered even decades later. He'd died of a heart attack in 1998, found in his kitchen by his daughter Dorothy, eyes reportedly wide open as if he'd seen something terrifying in his final moments. The timeline matched Rebecca's discoveries too perfectly to be coincidence. Harris had stolen the gold, murdered the guard who could identify him, hidden both in the basement of his home, and then spent the next 11 years trapped by what he'd done. The money had bought him freedom from financial stress, but imprisoned him in fear. Rebecca wondered if she was following the same path. The constant vigilance, the lies, the way she jumped at unexpected sounds, was this how it had started for Harris, with justifications and careful planning that gradually transformed into paranoia and isolation. She pushed the thought away and focused on practical concerns. Converting gold without detection required a strategy that balanced risk against return. She identified 3 possible approaches. Fake inheritance required documentation she couldn't forge convincingly. Death certificates and wills and probate records that would be checked, verified, cross-referenced. The complexity alone made it untenable, and large inheritances triggered tax reviews that would expose the fraud. Multiple small sales to different dealers spread across maximum geographic distance offered safety through obscurity. Years of patient work, never establishing a pattern, always staying below reporting thresholds. Slow, but sustainable if she could maintain discipline. finding a single underground buyer who wouldn't ask questions, promised speed, but carried the highest risk. People who dealt in untraceable gold weren't known for ethical business practices. One wrong contact could cost Rebecca everything, including her life. She chose a hybrid approach. Begin with small sales, establishing a pattern of modest, sporadic income. Create a narrative about cleaning out an elderly aunt's estate, discovering old jewelry and coins gradually. Meanwhile, research larger-scale solutions for the future when she had better understanding of the landscape. The first transaction took place on a Saturday in mid-December. Rebecca drove 2.5 hours west to a coin shop in a small city she'd never visited before. The dealer, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Hill, examined the small gold nugget Rebecca had brought with professional detachment. "Where'd you get this?" Rebecca delivered the lie she'd rehearsed. "My aunt passed away last year. We've been slowly going through her things. She traveled a lot in her younger days, collected interesting pieces." Sandra weighed the nugget, tested it with acid, consulted a price chart. $625. Cash. Rebecca accepted with hands that wanted to shake but remained steady through pure will. She drove home with the money folded in her wallet, pulled into a rest stop, and allowed herself 10 minutes to cry from relief and guilt in equal measure. $625 bought groceries for 5 weeks and winter coats for all 3 girls. Over the next 6 weeks, Rebecca executed 7 more transactions. Different cities, different dealers, always at least 60 miles from Riverton. She developed a rotation northwest 1 week, southwest the next, then east, southeast, northwest, south. Never the same location twice. Never enough gold to trigger intense scrutiny. Just a woman liquidating inherited jewelry piece by piece, nothing to suggest the systematic conversion of a fortune in stolen gold. By late January, she'd accumulated $5,200 hidden in various locations throughout the house. The amount wouldn't change their circumstances fundamentally, but it meant they could eat something besides cereal for dinner. It meant the utility bills got paid without choosing between heat and electricity. It meant her daughters had proper winter clothes and school supplies and the small dignities that separated struggling from desperate. Kenneth Walker's presence in their lives had expanded beyond plumbing emergencies. He appeared with pizza on nights when Rebecca worked late, taught Nicole the basics of electrical theory, listened to Rachel practice recorder without wincing at the wrong notes. The girls had grown comfortable with him in the way children do when an adult proves consistently kind without demanding anything in return. Christmas Eve brought a small tree strapped to Kenneth's truck and carefully chosen presents for each daughter. For Brenda, a book about social justice movements. For Nicole, an advanced mathematics workbook that made her eyes light up. For Rachel, an art supply set that sent her into squealing delight. After the girls had gone to bed, Kenneth handed Rebecca a small box wrapped in silver paper. Inside lay a vintage brass compass, the metal worn smooth by decades of handling. "It belonged to my grandfather," Kenneth explained. "He used it to find his way home from the Pacific after World War II. I thought you might need it when the path forward isn't clear." Rebecca ran her finger over the compass glass, touched by the gesture and terrified by what it might mean. Did Kenneth suspect something? Had he noticed the new coats, the fuller refrigerator, the small improvements that her coffee shop salary couldn't explain? The words slipped out before she could stop them. What if the path leads somewhere I shouldn't go? Kenneth studied her with those steady eyes that had witnessed combat and come home to build a quiet life helping people. Sometimes the right path and the easy path aren't the same thing, but a good compass always points toward true north even when we choose to walk another direction. The gift felt simultaneously precious and accusatory. Rebecca hung it from a chain around her neck and felt its weight settle against her chest like a physical manifestation of conscience she couldn't quite silence. The letter arrived in late January, slipped through the mail slot with no return address. Inside, a printout of the same newspaper article about the 1987 gold theft that Taylor had shown her, but this copy had been marked with highlighter. Specific passages about William Harris. About the gold that was never recovered. About the investigation that had gone cold. Handwritten at the bottom in careful script, "I know what you found in my father's house. That gold belongs to my family. We need to talk. D.H. Rebecca burned the letter in the kitchen sink, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. But she couldn't burn away the fear that came with it, or the questions that multiplied like bacteria in her mind. D.H. Dorothy Harris, William's daughter, supposedly living somewhere far away, uninvolved with the property she'd inherited and abandoned. Except she wasn't uninvolved at all. She knew. Somehow she knew. The black sedan appeared the following week while Rebecca was shopping for groceries. She'd just loaded bags into her trunk when the vehicle pulled alongside close enough that she couldn't open her driver's door without squeezing past. The window lowered to reveal an elderly woman with sharp eyes and expensive clothes that didn't match the working-class parking lot. "Mrs. Winters, my name is Dorothy Harris. We need to talk about what you stole from my family." Before Rebecca could formulate a response, the window rose and the sedan pulled away, leaving her frozen beside her car with grocery bags slowly warming in the winter sun. Dorothy had found her, identified her, confronted her in public where Rebecca couldn't make a scene or demand explanations. The paranoia that had been building since the FBI's visit escalated into something more acute. Rebecca installed motion sensor lights around the house, cheap security cameras from the hardware store, new locks on every door and window. She checked the cameras obsessively, scanning for unfamiliar vehicles or loitering figures. Every car that slowed near their property became a threat. Every knock at the door sent her heart racing. Brenda noticed. Of course she noticed. "Mom, why do you keep looking out the window?" Rebecca invented an explanation about wanting to make sure the house was secure, about being cautious in a neighborhood with abandoned properties. But Brenda's skeptical expression said she wasn't fooled, just choosing not to press the issue yet. The girl was building a case, collecting evidence, waiting for the moment when she had enough pieces to demand truth her mother wouldn't be able to deflect. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. This time Dorothy hadn't bothered with subtlety. The envelope contained photographs, Rebecca entering the storage unit, loading items into her car, close-ups of the unit number itself. The note was brief and direct. "The gold is my inheritance. FBI might not know, but I do. Meet me alone, or I tell them everything. Wednesday, 8 p.m. Warehouse District 247. Industrial Road Unit 5. Come alone, or deal is off." Rebecca sat at her kitchen table holding the photographs and understanding that her carefully constructed secret had been compromised by someone who'd been watching, documenting, waiting. Dorothy Harris had been patient, and now she was making her move. Rebecca had 48 hours to decide how to respond. Ignore the demand and hope Dorothy was bluffing. Meet her and attempt to negotiate. Run, disappear. Take the girls and whatever gold she could carry. None of the options felt survivable. Kenneth found her sitting in his office the next afternoon, staring at the photographs spread across his desk. She'd driven to his plumbing business without conscious decision, some part of her recognizing that she couldn't carry this alone anymore. If someone had to choose, Rebecca heard herself say, between doing the right thing that might hurt their family or continuing to do something wrong that keeps their family safe, what should they choose? Kenneth set down the wrench he'd been holding and studied her face. Something in his expression suggested he'd been expecting this conversation for months. "This isn't hypothetical, is it?" Rebecca's fingers found the compass hanging around her neck. "No, it's the most real thing I've ever faced." Kenneth closed the office door and sat across from her, close enough that their knees almost touched in the cramped space. She told him everything. The gold in the basement, the decision to keep it, the systematic sales, the FBI investigation she'd narrowly survived. And now Dorothy Harris, emerging from whatever shadows she'd been hiding and demanding payment for silence. Kenneth listened without interrupting his expression, cycling through shock and understanding, and something that might have been disappointment or might have been sympathy. When Rebecca finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "What does your heart tell you to do?" Rebecca closed her eyes and felt the weight of the compass against her skin. "That I'm tired of living someone else's crime. That I want my daughters to be proud of who I am, not just what I provide. That maybe there's a way forward that doesn't require looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life." Kenneth's hand reached for hers, calloused fingers rough against her palm. Then maybe it's time to stop running. You don't have to face this alone. Whatever happens, I'll help with the girls, with the house, with whatever you need. Wednesday arrived clear and cold. Rebecca had arranged for the girls to stay with Kenneth's sister, telling them she had an important business meeting. Brenda's eyes had narrowed at the explanation, but she'd gotten into the car without argument. Kenneth parked his truck 2 blocks from the warehouse address, binoculars on the dashboard phone, ready to call 911 if Rebecca's check-in text didn't arrive within 30 minutes. They'd planned as much as possible given the constraints, but both of them knew that Dorothy Harris had chosen the location specifically because it offered her advantages Rebecca couldn't counter. The warehouse district sprawled abandoned and dark broken streetlights casting pools of shadow between buildings that had once housed manufacturing operations, now long relocated overseas. Unit 5 at 247 Industrial Road sat behind a rusted door, slightly ajar, light visible through the gap. Rebecca pushed the door open and stepped into a space that echoed her footsteps back from high ceilings and concrete floors. In the center of the empty room, a folding table held 2 chairs. Dorothy Harris sat in one of them, waiting with the patience of someone who'd spent years planning this confrontation. Age had sharpened Dorothy's features rather than softening them. Somewhere in her 60s, expensively dressed despite the shabby location, she watched Rebecca approach with eyes that held calculation rather than emotion. "Mrs. Winters, thank you for coming." Her voice carried the cultured accent of education and privilege, incongruous with the threatening tone of her letters. "Please sit." Rebecca remained standing. "What do you want?" Dorothy smiled without warmth. "Direct. I appreciate that. What I want is simple. What's mine?" She leaned forward, hands folded on the table, in a gesture that might have seemed reasonable in different context. "You're living in my house, using my father's gold. That makes you a thief twice over." Rebecca tried reason despite knowing it wouldn't work. "Your father stole that gold. He killed Joseph Clark for it." Dorothy's expression hardened. "My father was desperate, just like you. Both single parents doing whatever necessary to survive. We're not so different, Mrs. Winters." The comparison felt like acid on Rebecca's skin, but Dorothy continued before she could object. "William Harris worked for Cascade Mining for 15 years. They paid him nothing, treated him like dirt. When the opportunity came in 1987, he took it. Wouldn't you have done the same?" Rebecca's voice came out harder than she'd intended. "He murdered someone. An innocent man with a family." Dorothy waved a dismissive hand. "Joseph Clark was in the wrong place at the wrong time. My father didn't want to kill him, but Clark wouldn't cooperate." The casual disregard for a man's life, the justification of murder as inconvenient necessity, told Rebecca everything she needed to know about who Dorothy Harris was beneath the expensive clothes and cultured voice. Dorothy pulled out her phone and tapped the screen showing Agent Taylor's contact information. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me half the gold. Exactly half. I'll disappear, never tell the FBI, never bother you again." She let that sit for a moment before delivering the threat. "Or I call my new friend Agent Taylor. Give her these photographs, the storage unit location, everything. You go to prison. Your daughters go to foster care." Dorothy's smile turned predatory. "Choose." Rebecca looked at the woman who had stalked her, photographed her, waited for the perfect moment to destroy her, and felt something shift in her chest. This woman didn't care about justice or family legacy. She cared only about money, about profiting from her father's crime without accepting responsibility for it. The word came out steady, definitive. "No." Dorothy's smile faltered. "Excuse me. No, I won't give you anything. I'm going to the FBI myself tomorrow morning. I'll cooperate fully, return the gold, ask for immunity." Dorothy stood, face twisting with rage that shattered her carefully maintained composure. "You stupid woman! You think they'll give you immunity? You're a criminal, just like my father, just like me." Rebecca met her eyes and saw the truth clearly now. "Maybe, but I'm done being like your father, done living in fear, done looking over my shoulder." She turned toward the door and Dorothy's voice followed her, rising to a scream. You want to tell Agent Taylor, go ahead. You'll just confirm what I'm already telling her, but she'll also learn you tried to blackmail me for your father's stolen property. Your father killed Joseph Clark. You want to profit from that murder? What do you think the FBI will do to you?" Dorothy's hands shook as she grabbed the table edge. "You self-righteous hypocrite. You've been profiting for months, sleeping in that house, living off my father's work. At least I'm honest about what I am." Rebecca paused at the door, looking back one final time. "You're right, but I'm done pretending." She walked into the cold night air, Dorothy's screams echoing behind her. Kenneth emerged from his truck before she'd made it 20 feet, pulling her into an embrace that grounded her in the reality of her decision. "Are you okay? What happened?" Rebecca's hands shook, but her voice came steady. "I told her no. I told her I'm going to the FBI myself." Kenneth held her tighter. "I'm proud of you." Rebecca cried against his shoulder, not from fear, but from the relief of having finally chosen a path that pointed toward true north instead of temporary safety. She'd made her decision. Tomorrow she would call Agent Taylor and offer full cooperation in exchange for immunity. Whatever happened after that, at least she'd be done running from the weight of secrets that had been crushing her since the moment she'd found gold in her basement wall. The compass hung heavy against her chest needle, finding north despite the interference of warehouse metal and winter cold and her own terrible choices. Some directions held true regardless of how far you'd wandered from the path. Thursday morning broke with the kind of clarity that comes after storms pass. Rebecca stood in her kitchen watching pale light filter through windows she'd repaired with her own hands, phone heavy in her palm. Agent Taylor's number glowed on the screen, waiting for her to make the call that would either save or destroy everything. She pressed dial before fear could override decision. Taylor answered on the first ring, voice alert despite the early hour. "Agent Taylor, this is Rebecca Winters from Oakwood Avenue. I need to speak with you about the Joseph Clark case and about what I found in my basement." The pause on the line stretched long enough that Rebecca heard her own heartbeat in the silence. Then Taylor's voice returned carefully neutral. "I'm listening, Mrs. Winters." Rebecca took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. "I'd like to come in, voluntarily. I want immunity in writing. Full immunity for me, protection for my family. In exchange, I'll return every ounce of gold I have left, tell you exactly where it came from, what I did with it. All of it." Another pause, this one carrying surprise Taylor couldn't quite mask. "I'll need approval from superiors, Mrs. Winters, but I think we can make that happen. No guarantees on timing, though. Federal bureaucracy moves slowly." "How long?" "Week, maybe 2. Meanwhile, don't move the gold, don't sell anymore, don't leave town." Rebecca ended the call and stood staring at the phone until Kenneth's hand on her shoulder reminded her she wasn't alone in this anymore. He'd stayed the night on the couch after the warehouse confrontation, unwilling to leave her and the girls unprotected if Dorothy decided to escalate. Before anything else, before FBI negotiations or legal wrangling, Rebecca had to tell her daughters the truth. She gathered them in the living room after breakfast, Kenneth sitting quietly in the corner, providing silent support. Brenda clutched her book without reading. Nicole's notebook lay unopened on her lap. Rachel held her favorite stuffed rabbit and watched her mother with eyes that already knew something bad was coming. Rebecca knelt on the floor in front of them, bringing herself to their eye level for what felt like the most important conversation of her life. "Girls, I need to tell you something important. When we first moved here, I found something in the basement, something valuable, something that was connected to a crime." She watched their faces process this information. Brenda's eyes narrowed. Nicole's hand went still on her notebook. Rachel's grip on the rabbit tightened. "I made a mistake. I kept it instead of reporting it. I've been using it to help us, to fix the house, buy food, keep us warm. But it was wrong. And now I'm going to make it right." Rachel's voice came small and scared. "Are you in trouble, Mommy?" The question pierced Rebecca's heart clean through. "Maybe, baby, but I'm trying to fix it." Nicole, always needing concrete details, asked what Rebecca had dreaded. "What did you find?" "Money. A lot of money. But it wasn't mine to keep." Brenda stood abruptly, arms crossed over her chest, tears streaming down her face in a way Rebecca hadn't seen since Christopher left. "How long have you known about this?" "Since November. About 3 months." The betrayal in Brenda's eyes felt worse than any prison sentence. "You've been lying to us for 3 months." Rebecca nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Brenda's voice broke on the words. "I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. Every time you looked at us, part of you was somewhere else, guarding that secret, keeping us out." The worst came next, delivered with the devastating honesty only a 13-year-old who'd been forced to grow up too fast could manage. "You taught us to always tell the truth, to do the right thing even when it's hard, but you've been doing the opposite this whole time. How are we supposed to trust you now?" Rebecca reached for her daughter, but Brenda stepped back, maintaining distance that hurt more than any physical blow. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was being a strong mother. But I was wrong. I was scared. And I made bad choices." Nicole's practical voice cut through the emotion. "What happens to our house? What about school? Our friends? What about us?" Rebecca wiped tears and forced herself to give honest answers. "We might have to live more simply again, but we won't lose the house. I promise. Most importantly, we won't lose each other. This time I'm going to do things the right way, even if it's harder." Kenneth spoke from his corner, for the first time, his presence a reminder that they weren't completely alone. "Your mom's being very brave. Most people would keep running, keep hiding, but she's choosing to face what she did wrong. That takes more courage than anything." Brenda looked at him, then back at Rebecca, and finally nodded, though her eyes still held hurt that wouldn't heal quickly. Rachel climbed into Rebecca's lap, seeking comfort neither of them could fully provide. Nicole simply sat processing the information with the same methodical approach she brought to everything, already calculating odds and potential outcomes. They spent the rest of the day together, talking in fits and starts, crying, beginning the slow process of rebuilding trust that had been fractured by 3 months of careful deception. Monday morning brought Rebecca to Hartford's FBI field office alone. The building loomed institutional and intimidating, its government aesthetic designed to remind visitors of federal power and consequence. She passed through security with a visitor badge that felt like the first step across a threshold she couldn't uncross. The conference room held 3 people, instead of the 2 Rebecca had expected. Agent Taylor sat with her usual professional composure. Agent Anderson wore an expensive suit that announced his Treasury Department authority. The third person, a severe-looking woman in her 50s, introduced herself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Linda Martinez. Anderson opened with formal precision. "Mrs. Winters, Agent Taylor has briefed me on your situation. I understand you found yourself in possession of assets connected to the 1987 Cascade Mining gold theft." The careful phrasing made Rebecca's crimes sound almost accidental. She cut through the euphemism with plain truth. "I found gold hidden in my basement wall next to human remains. I knew it was wrong to keep it, but I did anyway, for 3 months. I've been selling it piece by piece, using the money to support my family." No excuses, no justifications, just facts laid bare in a windowless room that smelled of coffee and stress. Anderson nodded, expression revealing nothing. "And you're prepared to surrender the remaining gold and cooperate with our investigation?" "Yes. But I want full immunity in writing. I have 3 daughters who depend on me. I can't risk prison." Taylor and Anderson exchanged glances that Rebecca couldn't interpret. Martinez tapped her pen against a leather portfolio, the sound sharp in the small space. "Mrs. Winters' immunity agreements are complex legal instruments requiring Justice Department approval and multiple levels of review. We can't give you that today." She slid a typed letter across the table. "What we can offer is this preliminary document stating our intent to recommend immunity in exchange for your full cooperation." Rebecca read the carefully worded language that promised nothing concrete. Recommend rather than guarantee. Consideration rather than commitment. Subject to approval rather than confirmed. This doesn't guarantee I won't be prosecuted. Martinez's smile held no warmth. Nothing in life is guaranteed, Mrs. Winters. But consider the alternative. We have enough evidence to open a formal investigation into your activities. Bank records, travel patterns, financial transactions that don't match your reported income, storage unit rental under a false name, fake identification, structured cash deposits. Anderson took over seamlessly. Without your cooperation, that investigation proceeds with all the public exposure and media attention that entails. Your daughters would see their mother arrested, handcuffed, processed through the criminal justice system on evening news. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca thought of Brenda's hurt eyes, Nicole's analytical assessment of their situation, Rachel's innocent faith that Mommy could fix anything. She signed the document with handwriting that remained steady through pure force of will. Martinez tucked the papers away. You take us to the gold, all of it, including whatever you've already sold. We'll need documentation, buyers' amounts, dates, everything. Taylor added her own requirements. Financial records, the fake ID storage unit information, complete transparency, Mrs. Winters. One lie, one omission, and the deal is off. The drive to the storage facility unfolded in tense silence. Rebecca led the way in her SUV, 3 federal agents following in an unmarked vehicle that screamed law enforcement despite its bland exterior. Every mile felt like walking deeper into commitment she couldn't reverse. At Unit 247, Rebecca unlocked the door and stepped aside, allowing the agents to enter first. Anderson's low whistle echoed off metal walls as he surveyed the containers stacked with the same precision William Harris had once used to hide them underground. Taylor began photographing everything with methodical efficiency. The forensic accountant they'd brought started an inventory scanning barcodes Rebecca hadn't known existed, typing numbers into a tablet with focused concentration. Anderson turned to Rebecca with an expression that managed to convey professional curiosity without judgment. How much have you already sold? Rebecca forced herself to maintain eye contact. About 30% of what I originally found. I didn't keep exact records at first, but I have receipts from most transactions, hidden at the house. And the money? Some spent on house repairs and living expenses. The rest is in various locations. About $4,000 in cash hidden at home, $1,200 in my checking account under my real name. The admission of that last detail felt particularly damning. She'd known better, but had been careless anyway, exhausted by the constant deception. Rebecca hesitated before delivering the information that would cost her the last escape route. There's more. I moved some gold recently before I decided to come forward, to a cabin in the woods about 60 miles north of here. I bought it through a shell company as a backup plan in case things went wrong. Martinez's eyebrows rose in what might have been professional appreciation for thorough criminality. Where exactly is this cabin? Rebecca provided the address and directions, explained the cash purchase through an intermediary broker, admitted to creating the fake ID through online channels she'd researched in library computers. Each confession peeled away another layer of protection, left her more exposed to consequences she could no longer control. The inventory consumed hours. By late afternoon, they'd sealed the unit, arranged for secure transport to a federal facility, and compiled a list of questions that would require days of detailed answers. Anderson informed her that a team would recover the cabin gold tomorrow, and she would accompany them to show exactly where everything was hidden. When they finally released her, Taylor walked Rebecca to her car. The gesture felt deliberate, creating space for conversation away from Anderson's authority and Martinez's prosecutorial assessment. You did the right thing today. Not everyone would come forward voluntarily. Rebecca unlocked her car, exhaustion settling into bones. Didn't feel voluntary. You were investigating me. Dorothy Harris was blackmailing me. Felt more like the only option left. Taylor's expression shifted slightly, revealing something that might have been respect beneath the professional veneer. Maybe. But you chose this. Could have run, disappeared, taken your daughters and whatever gold you could carry. But you didn't. That counts for something. She paused before asking the question that seemed genuinely curious rather than tactical. What made you decide to confess? Rebecca thought about Brenda's devastating question, Rachel's innocent fear, Nicole's practical assessment of their crumbling situation. My daughter asked if she could trust me anymore. I realized if I kept going the way I was, the answer would always be no. The following 3 weeks established a rhythm of confession and documentation. Each morning, Rebecca reported to Hartford, working with investigators to map every transaction, every decision, every moment of the 3 months she'd spent converting William Harris's stolen fortune into her family's survival. Anderson proved less adversarial than his severe demeanor suggested. His primary interest lay in recovering assets and understanding methodology, rather than punishing Rebecca personally. During one session, he made an observation that carried grudging professional respect. For someone with no criminal background, you constructed a remarkably sophisticated operation. Multiple identity layers, strategic transaction patterns, careful geographic distribution. Most amateurs make catastrophic mistakes within weeks. Rebecca wasn't sure whether to take that as compliment or indictment. Desperation tends to sharpen focus. The investigation expanded beyond Rebecca's activities to re-examine the original 1987 theft. With her cooperation, FBI analysts traced William Harris's financial history, uncovering bank records that showed payments to 2 other former Cascade Mining employees. Both men had died in the early 1990s under circumstances that looked increasingly suspicious given what they now knew. Taylor shared the findings one afternoon over coffee in the FBI break room. Harris had accomplices, probably eliminated them within 3 years of the theft. The gold you found was just his share, roughly 70% of the total. The rest was already spent decades ago by dead men. Rebecca asked about Joseph Clark, needing to understand the full scope of what Harris had done. Taylor's expression turned somber. Based on forensic analysis, Harris abducted Clark during the heist, probably forced him to reveal the truck's security protocols, kept him restrained in the basement during the robbery, then murdered him after the gold was secured. The handcuffs suggest Clark was a prisoner for possibly days before his death. The clinical description turned Rebecca's stomach. She'd profited, however briefly, from a crime that had involved torture as well as theft and murder. When Rebecca asked about Dorothy Harris, Taylor's eyes sharpened with interest. "Still waiting for you to mention her. Why didn't you report the blackmail immediately?" "I was planning to confess anyway." Seemed irrelevant. A week later, Taylor called with an update. Dorothy Harris was arrested in Arizona. Attempted extortion, obstruction of justice. Turns out she's known about the gold for years. Waited for someone to find it so she could claim inheritance without getting her own hands dirty. A month into the investigation brought an unexpected development. Margaret Moore, CEO of Cascade Mining, requested a meeting. Rebecca found herself back in the Hartford conference room facing a woman whose authority radiated from tailored suit and silver-streaked hair arranged with corporate precision. Moore began with words Rebecca hadn't expected to hear. "Mrs. Winters, I wanted to meet the woman who found our gold after 37 years, and to thank you for coming forward." Rebecca's automatic response came defensive. "I kept it for months, sold 30%, used it for my own benefit." Moore nodded, acknowledging the truth without flinching from it. "Yes, you did, but you also provided the key to solving a crime that haunted our company and the Clark family for nearly 4 decades. That counts for something." The meeting continued with technical discussions about the gold's return, forensic accounting of Rebecca's sales, and the value of what had been recovered. Throughout, Moore observed Rebecca with an intensity that suggested she was trying to reconcile the desperate mother with the sophisticated criminal operation that had been documented. As the meeting concluded, Moore asked for a private moment. The agent stepped outside, leaving Rebecca alone with a woman whose position and power made her feel like a child called to the principal's office. "Off the record, Mrs. Winters, I understand why you did what you did." Rebecca stayed silent, uncertain where this was leading. Moore leaned forward, her corporate demeanor shifting to something more personal. "I grew up poor. Single mother, 5 children, eviction notices, homeless shelters. I know what desperation feels like, what it's like to choose between your ethics and your children's survival." The admission hung between them, this powerful CEO acknowledging a past that didn't match her present authority. "Joseph Clark wasn't just our employee. He was my uncle. My mother's younger brother. I was 16 when he disappeared. Watched my aunt destroy herself searching for answers that never came. Watched my cousin Amanda grow up without a father. The revelation struck Rebecca with unexpected force. Margaret Moore had personal stakes in this tragedy, family connections that made Joseph Clark more than a name in old newspaper articles. Our company has a substantial finder's fee policy, Moore continued, standard in the mining industry for recovery of stolen assets, 25% of recovered value. Rebecca's mind couldn't quite process the numbers. 25% of $42 million was $10.5 million, Mrs. Winters. The amount felt impossible. More than she'd stolen, more than she'd imagined. Legitimate legal taxable income offered by the niece of the man whose murder had made the theft possible. Agent Anderson tells me you've been fully cooperative. That makes you eligible under our corporate guidelines. Moore stood smoothing her jacket. Of course, this would be fully documented, taxable as ordinary income, completely legal, but it might help you and your daughters rebuild after this is resolved. After Moore left, Rebecca remained seated, tears streaming down her face, while Taylor and Anderson returned to find her still processing the moral mathematics that made no logical sense. Punishment transformed into reward, crime leading to redemption, loss becoming opportunity. Taylor sat beside her, professional distance finally cracking to reveal genuine empathy. Life rarely makes perfect moral sense, Mrs. Winters. Sometimes good people do bad things for understandable reasons. Sometimes bad actions lead to positive outcomes nobody could have predicted. The legal system tries to account for that complexity even when it doesn't always succeed. That evening, Rebecca received a call from an Arizona number. The woman on the line introduced herself hesitantly. Mrs. Winters, this is Amanda Clark, Joseph Clark's daughter. Margaret Moore gave me your number. I hope that's okay. Rebecca sat heavily on her bed, unprepared for direct connection to the victim's family. Of course. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry about your father. Amanda's voice carried warmth Rebecca hadn't expected. I wanted to thank you for what you did, for making sure he was found. You could have taken the gold and left him there forever, but you sent that letter to the FBI. You gave him back to us. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Amanda shared fragments of memories from before. Her father disappeared, spoke about her mother's death in 2015 without ever knowing the truth, described the questions that had shaped her entire life. Rather than accusation, her tone conveyed relief bordering on gratitude. Before they disconnected, Amanda made an unexpected proposal. I'd like to meet you in person, next month when the FBI formally closes the case. Would that be possible? Rebecca agreed, despite apprehension about facing this woman whose father she'd indirectly profited from. How could she look Amanda Clark in the eye and not see accusation she deserved? Days later, formal notification arrived by courier. The U.S. Attorney's Office had approved her immunity agreement. Rebecca signed it with Taylor and Anderson as witnesses, the moment marking an official end to the possibility of prosecution. Cascade Mining's legal department processed the finder's fee with surprising efficiency. Within a week, Rebecca had documentation confirming she would receive $10.5 million once the investigation formally concluded. After taxes, roughly $6.8 million, more money than she'd ever imagined possessing legally. But the amount came wrapped in questions she couldn't quite answer. Did she deserve this? Had her confession earned redemption, or just avoided punishment? Could money transform crime into justice, or would it always carry the stain of its origins? Kenneth found her sitting at the kitchen table one evening, staring at the finder's fee documentation while the girls did homework in the living room. He poured coffee without asking and sat across from her. Do you think you deserve this money? The question forced Rebecca to confront feelings she'd been avoiding. I don't know. Part of me thinks it's obscene, profiting from a situation I created by stealing in the first place. But another part feels like maybe it's a chance to do good, to use money the right way instead of the wrong way. Kenneth reached across the table for her hand. Maybe that's exactly the point. This isn't a reward for stealing. It's responsibility for choosing to come forward when you could have kept running. The difference between what you took And what you're being given is that you had to earn this second one by telling the truth even when it hurt. 2 weeks later, Rebecca flew to Phoenix with Taylor serving as FBI liaison for the case closure. Meeting Amanda Clark in person felt like approaching the final judgment on choices that had consumed the past 4 months. Amanda had her father's eyes from the old photographs, warm, direct kind in ways that made Rebecca's guilt feel heavier. They met at a quiet restaurant, Margaret Moore joining to facilitate introductions. Over lunch, conversation flowed more naturally than Rebecca had imagined possible. Amanda shared more memories, spoke about her husband, who was an architect specializing in affordable housing, mentioned the community development nonprofit she managed. Rebecca found herself explaining an idea that had been forming since Margaret first mentioned the finder's fee. What if I used the money to help other families like mine? Families one paycheck from homelessness. I could buy abandoned houses, renovate them to basic safety standards, then sell them for symbolic amounts to families who need them. Give them the same chance I had to rebuild their lives. Amanda's immediate enthusiasm surprised Rebecca. My husband could help with designs. I know banks and nonprofits that work in this space. We could make this really work. Margaret added corporate endorsement. Cascade Mining has been looking to expand our community impact. A housing initiative connected to Joseph's case would be meaningful for our relationship with the communities where we operate. By the end of lunch, Rebecca's personal restitution idea had evolved into a multi-stakeholder initiative with potential for real impact. They exchanged contact information, promised to connect lawyers and financial advisors, began sketching the framework of what would become the Joseph Clark Memorial Housing Foundation. In the parking lot, Amanda pulled Rebecca aside for a private word. When they found my father's remains, I thought it would be the end of something, the final chapter. But meeting you, hearing about this foundation idea, I realize it might actually be the beginning of something even more important than closure. Amanda's hug conveyed forgiveness Rebecca hadn't known how to ask for. We can't change the past, but we can decide what it means for our future. I think Dad would have liked the idea that his death ultimately created homes for families who need them. He always said his job was protecting what matters more than giving children safe places to grow up. The encounter transformed Rebecca's understanding of her own story. What had begun as crime motivated by desperation could evolve into something redemptive if she was willing to do the work of making it right. Back in Riverton, Rebecca accelerated planning. The FBI investigation was concluding with final documentation. Anderson had compiled his financial analysis with precision that documented every transaction. The finder's fee would process within 6 to 8 weeks. Rebecca also rebuilt her personal life. She registered for the final courses needed to renew her nursing license, planning to work part-time once certified while managing the foundation's growth. The coffee shop job would end with summer's symbolic closure of the chapter where she'd been desperate enough to steal. Her daughters participated fully now that truth had replaced secrets. Brenda researched similar housing initiatives online, drafting organizational structures with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Nicole created spreadsheets tracking potential properties and renovation costs. Rachel designed a logo featuring a house with a heart-shaped door and a key labeled with a $sign. The family dynamic had shifted fundamentally. Rebecca no longer carried the burden alone. Open communication had replaced the tension of hidden knowledge. Even disagreements felt healthy rather than fraught with unspoken meanings. Kenneth's role evolved beyond occasional helper to genuine partner. His construction expertise would prove invaluable for renovation projects. His steady presence had become stability the entire family relied on. One evening after the girls were in bed, Kenneth proposed taking their relationship beyond friendship. I've watched you rebuild this house and your life. I'd like to be part of what comes next if you'll have me, not as a helper but as a partner in everything. Rebecca felt hope bloom in her chest, fragile but real. She took his hand, remembering his words about broken things being worth fixing. I'd like that too, but I need you to understand I'm still figuring out who I am after all this. Kenneth smiled. Then we'll figure it out together. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for real. By late spring, the foundation had purchased its first 5 properties. Rebecca deliberately chose houses in various neighborhoods, wanting to avoid creating concentrated poverty while still reaching families in genuine need. Each renovation included basic safety upgrades, plus at least one special feature that transformed a house into a home. Reading nooks with built-in shelves, kitchen islands for family meals, garden benches on porches, small touches that communicated dignity rather than charity. The selection process balanced rigor with compassion. Applicants demonstrated financial need, committed to property maintenance, completed an 8-week financial literacy course, and agreed to participate in community improvement efforts. In return, they received houses for $1 access to ongoing counseling and support, and the chance to build equity rather than paying rent that disappeared into landlords' pockets. On a cold February morning, 14 months after Rebecca had bought her own house for $1, she stood on the porch of the foundation's first completed renovation. Beside her stood Melissa Garcia, a single mother who worked as a hospital custodian and had been living in an extended-stay motel after escaping domestic violence. Rebecca handed over the key and a crisp dollar bill. "This is really yours. You earned it by showing up to every class, by working hard, by fighting for your family. This is your second chance, same as I got." Melissa's teary embrace spoke volumes about the impact of what they'd created. Kenneth stood nearby with Melissa's 2 children, showing them their new bedrooms and backyard, his laughter mixing with theirs in a sound that filled the house with promise. Present for the ceremony were Brenda, Nicole, and Rachel, along with Amanda Clark, who'd flown in from Phoenix. Margaret Moore, representing Cascade mining agent Taylor in her new role as board member, and Donald Thompson, who'd brought homemade cookies for Melissa's children. Rebecca gave a short speech to the small crowd. 14 months ago, I bought a house for $1. I was desperate, homeless, afraid. That house saved my family. But it also taught me that second chances don't come from houses or money. They come from people who believe in you, from community that supports you, from choosing to do the right thing even when it's hard. Melissa, this house is your second chance. Don't waste it. Melissa nodded through tears. I won't. I promise. And someday when I'm stable, when my kids are grown and I'm okay, I want to do this for someone else, give someone their second chance. 5 years dissolved in a blur of growth and transformation. The foundation expanded to 12 cities across 4 states. Rebecca split time between part-time nursing at Riverton General and foundation management, finding that her healthcare background provided unique insights into the needs of families they served. She'd married Kenneth 3 years into the journey, a small backyard ceremony with her daughters as bridesmaids. They'd accepted him with varying degrees of enthusiasm that had deepened into genuine affection. The children had grown in ways that reflected the stability they'd finally found. Brenda was a college freshman studying social work, planning to return to the foundation after graduation. Nicole, a high school sophomore, handled financial modeling with skills beyond her years. Rachel had appointed herself the foundation's unofficial greeter, welcoming each new family with hand-drawn cards and homemade cookies. The house on Oakwood Avenue had evolved alongside its occupants. Kenneth had transformed the basement, where gold had once been hidden, into a workshop where he taught neighborhood children carpentry. The wall that had concealed William Harris's secret now displayed photographs of foundation families in their new homes. One autumn evening, Rebecca stood in the basement doorway watching Kenneth sand a cabinet door for their latest renovation. Her mind drifted to the night she'd first discovered the hidden wall, the skeleton, the terrible choice she'd made in the darkness of desperation. Kenneth looked up, reading her expression with the fluency of long partnership. "Thinking about old times?" Rebecca accepted the coffee he offered. "Thinking about Joseph Clark. About how sometimes the worst things lead to the best things, if you're willing to do the hard work of making it right." The Joseph Clark Memorial Housing Foundation had purchased and renovated over 200 properties serving more than 800 people. Success rates exceeded projections. Families stayed in their homes, found employment, watched their children thrive in stable environments. Rebecca had received recognition she deflected at every opportunity. Awards and media attention that she redirected toward the families who'd done the actual work of transforming houses into homes, and desperation into determination. But she never hid her past. Every interview, every speech included the full story of finding gold, keeping it facing FBI investigation, choosing to confess. I'm not an inspiration because I'm perfect. I'm proof that making terrible mistakes doesn't mean you can't still do good. That second chances are real if you're willing to earn them. That evening, her family gathered for dinner in the kitchen that had once been cold and empty. Brenda, home from college, talked about her social work classes with passion. Nicole calculated foundation ROI on a napkin. Rachel sketched designs for new family welcome packets. Kenneth prepared food with the quiet competence that characterized everything he did. Rebecca looked around the table at the people she loved most and felt the transformation complete. The house around them had evolved from broken shell into true home through relationships forged within its walls and promises kept through difficulty. As they settled into their meal, Rachel looked up from her sketchbook. "Can I say something?" Everyone paused, curious. Rachel's young face turned serious. "I'm glad we were poor. Not glad, but if we hadn't been, we wouldn't have found this house. We wouldn't have started the foundation. Melissa and her kids and all those other families wouldn't have homes now. So like bad things happened to us, but we made good things happen because of them." Brenda reached across to ruffle her sister's hair. "Yeah, Rach, it really is." Nicole added with characteristic practicality, "Though statistically speaking, we got really lucky with the finder's fee." Kenneth raised his water glass. "To second chances, and to the family who helped me find mine, too." Rebecca met his eyes across the table, remembering the man who'd stood by her through the worst, who'd offered a compass when she was lost, who'd loved her despite knowing every mistake. They went around the table, sharing gratitude. Rachel thanked their house for being broken and becoming beautiful. Nicole thanked their mother for teaching them that doing good mattered more than making money. Brenda thanked Rebecca for being brave enough to tell the truth, even when it was terrifying. Kenneth thanked the family for choosing him. Rebecca thanked her daughters for giving her a second chance, even when she hadn't deserved it. Outside evening settled over Oakwood Avenue. Other families were sitting down to dinner in houses they'd bought for $1, building their own foundations of hope on ground that had once seemed impossible to cultivate. Over 200 families now spread across multiple states, each one someone's second chance. The Joseph Clark Memorial Housing Foundation continued its work, one family at a time, one house at a time, one community at a time. Proof that even the darkest secrets could sometimes yield unexpected light. That crime could transform into redemption if someone was willing to do the work. Rebecca's hand found the compass still hanging around her neck after all these years. The needle quivered slightly, finding north despite interference. Despite everything, mistakes, crimes, moral compromises, despite the journey through darkness, the compass still pointed true. She closed her eyes, surrounded by her family's warmth and chatter, and thought about William Harris dying alone and afraid, about Dorothy Harris arrested and bitter, about Joseph Clark finally at rest, about Amanda transforming grief into purpose, about Melissa Garcia and 200 other families safe in homes they owned. True north found. Finally home. Not just a place on Oakwood Avenue, but a direction chosen deliberately, walked toward, with intention reached through honest work of making amends. The broken house had become beautiful. The desperate crime had transformed into a legacy of hope. One woman's terrible choice in the basement's darkness had become hundreds of families' salvation in the light. Some prices were worth paying. Some paths were worth walking. Some compass needles pointed true no matter how far you'd wandered if you were brave enough to follow them home.